The first sound was laughter, not the bitter kind that erupts in defiance, but the rolling, incredulous laughter of men who could not believe what they were seeing. At Fort Devens in Massachusetts. Winter of 1944, a crate of American playing cards had been tossed into the barracks of captured German soldiers. The cards were garish to their eyes, printed in bold reds and blacks, with glossy coatings that caught the dim lamplight. The Europeans were accustomed to their own sets, austere and serious, with intricate engravings in sober shades. To them, cards were a matter of strategy, intellect, and national tradition. These American decks looked more like circus posters than instruments of thought. The laughter spread like wildfire. Prisoners slapped their knees, mocking the oversized spades and hearts. Some waved them in the air as if fanning away the boredom of confinement. One officer, Hauptmann Ernst Köhler, once a schoolteacher from Leipzig, shook his head and muttered for all to hear, "This is a toy for children, not for men." His words earned approving nods from others, who saw in these cards yet another symbol of American frivolity, to men who had been raised on the pride of German culture. This was confirmation that the enemy lacked seriousness, depth, and refinement. Yet even as the ridicule rang out, the silence that followed was telling. A few younger prisoners held the cards a little longer, rubbing the slick surface with their thumbs. The foreign smell of fresh ink and cardboard was unlike the coarse decks of home. Some were reminded of Berlin's smoky cafes, where games of scat had once lasted into the early hours. Others thought of evenings before the war, when neighbors gathered around a table, not to plot conquests, but to pass time. Outside, the cold gnawed at the wooden barracks, snow pressed against the fences, muffling the guards' boots in the distance. Inside, the men turned the cards over again and again, their faces hard but their eyes curious. Even Köhler, who had mocked them so loudly, tucked a queen of hearts into his coat pocket, perhaps without even realizing it. The scene revealed something larger than a deck of cards. It exposed a cultural fault line between old world and new. Europe valued gravity, intellect, the art of calculation. America seemed to revel in lightness, brightness, distraction. To the prisoners, these flimsy rectangles of paper appeared to embody that difference. And yet, for all their sneers, the men kept the decks close, as though the simple existence of such color in their gray confinement whispered a dangerous promise that laughter could return, even here, even now. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? The barracks grew quieter after the laughter faded, but the divide remained. For the German prisoners, those bright American playing cards were more than objects of ridicule. They were reminders of an entirely different culture. In the dim hours before lights out, men argued softly across their bunks, the conversations drifting like smoke through the wooden beams. Some clung fiercely to their pride. Oberfeldwebel Hans Richter, a career non-commissioned officer from Hamburg, declared to a cluster of younger conscripts, "In Germany, our games sharpen the mind. Skat, Doppelkopf, Tarok. These are contests of intelligence, not children's amusement." His voice was firm, almost didactic, the way he had once lectured new recruits. Others nodded in agreement, convinced that their heritage carried superior discipline and sophistication. They remembered evenings in Vienna or Dresden, where families gathered over dense card games, each move demanding calculation, memory, and long hours of concentration. The Europeans had woven these traditions into their culture. To them, strategy and leisure reflected strategy in life, an orderliness that mirrored the rigor of their armies and the pride of their nations. By contrast, the American decks seemed shallow, designed only for distraction. One prisoner, a former law student named Karl Weiss, muttered bitterly, "Americans only know how to amuse themselves. They have no depth." It was more than a complaint about a deck of cards. It was a judgment of an entire society, a civilization of movies, jazz, and chewing gum, now confronting men raised on Goethe, Wagner, and Schiller. Yet beneath the disdain lurked insecurity. The Americans had conquered them not only with tanks and planes, but with abundance, with the luxury of play. While German cities smoldered under Allied bombs, their captors could spare the time to shuffle cards and laugh. The prisoners, stripped of weapons and freedom, wondered if perhaps this capacity for frivolity was its own form of strength. That night, ideological lines were drawn in whispers. Officers lectured about cultural superiority, insisting the men ignore enemy toys. Young soldiers listened, half convinced, half doubtful, the cards still glimmering in their minds. The divide was no longer just between barbed wire and rifles, but between two visions of the world, one that exalted intellect and tradition, and another that found meaning in joy and simplicity, in that wooden barracks, under weak bulbs and the stench of damp clothes. The prisoners confronted an unsettling truth. Perhaps laughter itself was a weapon, one they had forgotten how to wield. It began with a sound, sharp, rhythmic, almost like a drumbeat in the night. The men in the barracks stirred from their cots as faint echoes drifted in through the thin wooden walls. At first it was indistinct, but then came the unmistakable slap of cardboard on wood thatch, followed by bursts of laughter and the rise and fall of voices outside. The American guards had set up a table near the fence, under a lantern that swung in the winter wind. Cards flashed and fell in quick succession. Every so often, coins clinked or buttons rolled across the boards, serving as makeshift stakes. The guards leaned back in their chairs, shouting, teasing, their voices carrying into the barracks where the prisoners lay awake. Several Germans rose to the small windows and peered out. The sight was almost surreal. Armed men, enemies in uniform, gathered not in watchful silence but in noisy play. One young prisoner, 19-year-old Helmut Bauer, whispered to his bunkmate, "Why does this children's game make them laugh so much?" His words hung in the air, unanswered. The curiosity spread. Some men shook their heads dismissively, muttering about American shallowness. Yet others watched intently, drawn by the rhythm of the play. Each slap of a card seemed to mark time, a tempo that pulled them closer despite themselves. They could not see the rules, but they could feel the energy a bluff called, a bet raised, an explosion of laughter that cut through the bitter cold. Inside, the contrast was stark. The German prisoners sat in their silence, huddled in blankets, their breaths misting in the frigid air. Outside, the guards' faces glowed in the lantern light, alive with motion, cheer, and a freedom of spirit the captives could no longer claim. For a moment, the prisoners were not thinking of hunger or the war's uncertain end, but of those cards. Even Hauptmann Köhler, who had ridiculed them as toys, found himself watching. His sharp gaze betrayed a trace of envy of the laughter, of the ease, of the way the Americans seemed to shrug off the weight of the world with a single game. He turned away quickly, as if ashamed of the thought. That night, the slap of cards and the rumble of laughter became a rhythm against the silence of captivity. The men lay awake, restless, listening. By morning, curiosity had begun to gnaw at their pride. The toys they had mocked now seemed to carry a strange power, a power to create a world beyond the wire, if only for a night. The invitation came almost by accident. A deck, worn from nights of use, was slipped across the fence by a grinning guard. No words, just a nod, as if to say, "Try it yourself." For a long moment, no one moved. The cards lay on the ground between mud and snow, symbols of something both trivial and strangely forbidden. Finally, a young prisoner bent down and picked them up, his fingers hesitant, as though touching contraband. At first, the men handled the cards awkwardly. They shuffled clumsily, the slick paper sliding from their hands. The rules were explained in broken German and gestures simple, direct. Unlike the complex strategies of skat or tarok. The first round was stiff. A handful of men sat around a crude wooden table, their faces carved in stone, moving cards without interest. But then came a twist, a bluff revealed, a hand lost in sudden, dramatic fashion. One prisoner, Oberleutnant Franz Adler Stern, with a face hardened by Stalingrad, smirked at the simplicity of it all, until a farm boy beside him slammed down a winning hand. The barracks erupted in laughter. Even Adler, who had sworn he would never stoop to such childish amusement, leaned back and chuckled, shaking his head at his defeat. What began as reluctance turned to eagerness. The speed of the game surprised them, the sudden turns of fortune, the exhilaration of a gamble made and lost. Unlike their familiar games that demanded long concentration, this was quick, unpredictable, and strangely liberating within minutes. The air in the barracks had changed. The men leaned forward, voices rising, eyes alive. By the second game, buttons had been gathered from tunics to serve as chips. Bets were whispered fiercely, hands slammed down with growing confidence, for the first time since capture. The prisoners' laughter was not mocking, but genuine, sharp, unguarded, and full. The sound startled even themselves, echoing against the wooden walls, as though awakening something long buried. The guards outside heard it too, for a moment. The balance of power shifted. The captors no longer seemed to hold entertainment alone. The prisoners had discovered a new rhythm, a new fire. The barbed wire still stood, the war still raged, but around that table the world was briefly transformed. And as the cards fluttered down like falling leaves, the men began to realize they had crossed an invisible threshold. What had been mocked as childish was now becoming irresistible. The barracks changed in ways no one had expected. What had started as a moment of laughter soon grew into a nightly ritual. By early 1945, entire tables were claimed for card play as soon as supper ended. Long planks balanced on crates became makeshift gaming halls. The lamplight flickered against the walls, casting shadows of men bent over their hands, whispering, laughing, slamming down cards with a vigor that startled even themselves. For those hours, they forgot. They forgot the barbed wire that hemmed them in, the watchtowers with rifles glinting in the moonlight, the gnawing uncertainty of when the war would end or if their homes still stood. Around the tables, they were not prisoners of war, but rivals, gamblers, bluffers, men who dared to wager on chance when everything else had been taken from them. The atmosphere carried a strange electricity. Even men who once sneered at the American decks now counted buttons with trembling hands, their eyes darting with anticipation. One night, a diary entry from Gefreiter Otto Schenk recorded, "We lost everything on the battlefield, yet I won 3 bars of soap in the barracks tonight. I laughed harder than I have in years." The game bled into every corner of camp life. Prisoners argued over rules, scribbled strategies on scraps of paper, and swapped gossip about who had the best poker face. The sound of shuffling cards became as constant as the wind through the wire. For a moment each night, the war disappeared beneath the rhythm of the game. Statistics tell us that by spring 1945, the U.S. Playing Card Company in Cincinnati was producing more than 30 million decks annually, a staggering figure that supplied not only American households, but also military camps, canteens, and POW compounds. For the German prisoners, this abundance was unimaginable. Back home, entire industries had collapsed under Allied bombing. Here, in captivity, decks of cards seemed as plentiful as bread. As weeks passed, exhaustion mingled with joy. Men slumped over tables, faces softened in sleep while cards lay scattered around them. The sound of snores blended with the faint rustle of paper in the darkness. The barracks had been transformed less a prison, more a theater of fragile freedom. In those hours of play, they were not soldiers, nor enemies, nor captives. They were simply men holding on to a fleeting chance at laughter. And one question hovered in the silence of dawn. How could a handful of flimsy cards succeed where speeches and ideology had failed in silencing the war? Even for a night. By the time spring winds rattled the camp fences, the games had outgrown the barracks. Lanterns were carried into the open air, tables dragged outside, and voices rose into the night sky. At first, guards watched from a distance, leaning against rifles, smirking at the intensity with which the prisoners played. But then something shifted. One evening, when the laughter grew loudest, a guard set down his rifle, pulled up a chair, and began to shuffle the deck. The sight was astonishing. Men who had once been enemies across battlefields now sat shoulder to shoulder, their fingers brushing the same worn cards. A sergeant from Ohio joked in broken German, "Tonight, we're just players." The words carried weight far beyond the game itself. For a few hours, there was no captor, no captive, only men chasing fortune through spades and hearts. Rumors spread quickly through the camp. Some whispered that an American corporal had lost his week's chocolate rations to a German sergeant over a reckless bluff. Others claimed that a chaplain scolded both prisoners and guards for gambling with souls. There were even stories of a colonel who tried to forbid the mixing. only to discover his own adjutant sneaking into the games at night. The games blurred boundaries. Language barriers dissolved in gestures, a shrug, a grin, a hand slapped down in triumph. The prisoners began to call some guards by their first names, and guards, in turn, learned to pronounce the harsh consonants of German surnames. A peculiar fellowship emerged, stitched together by the rhythm of cards flicking against wood. Not everyone approved. In some barracks, older officers grumbled that this was dishonor, that the Wehrmacht's dignity was being eroded by child's play with the enemy. Yet their words sounded hollow, drowned out by the clatter of buttons used as chips and the bursts of laughter echoing past curfew. By midnight, the games became a world unto themselves. Under the moonlight, the camp no longer felt like a cage, but like a strange community, fragile and fleeting. The men knew the war was not over, that their families lived among ruins, that their futures were uncertain. But at the card table, they were not enemies. They were gamblers, bluffers, and most of all, human beings. And so the guards dealt the cards, the prisoners placed their bets, and for one unforgettable night after another, the barbed wire seemed to vanish into the darkness. By the time repatriation orders arrived in 1946, the war had long ended, but the memories of those nights endured. The prisoners, gaunt and weary, packed their few belongings into crates and satchels. Among the rolled socks and folded letters, some smuggled small treasures, a button saved as a lucky chip, a queen of spades hidden in a coat lining, or a full deck flattened under a shirt. These were not the trophies of conquest, but relics of survival. Proof of nights when laughter returned to men who had thought it gone forever. Years later, in post-war Germany, those memories rippled into family stories. In villages still scarred by bomb craters, old soldiers sat at kitchen tables, telling tales not only of hardship, but of that strange, absurd miracle American playing cards. One veteran, now a grandfather, would lean back in his chair and say to his wide-eyed grandson, "I once laughed at them. I thought them childish. But in captivity, those cards gave me a night of freedom I will never forget." The boy would stare at the faded deck, edges frayed, unable to imagine how something so small could mean so much. Historians who collected these testimonies found a pattern, again and again. Men recalled not just hunger or cold, but the cards, the shuffle, the slap on wood, the rush of a bet. The American decks had become symbols of contradiction, mocked as trivial, yet remembered as profound. They stood for a moment when the iron bars of war bent under the weight of simple human joy. As they boarded ships bound for Bremen or Hamburg, some prisoners carried the cards openly, others concealed them as if smuggling contraband. They feared the loss of that fragile reminder, more than they feared the ruins awaiting them at home. To return without those cards was to return without proof that joy could survive captivity. The final image lingers in silence. A single card, lifted by the wind, turns slowly in the air. It lands on the dirt, face up, the moonlight glinting across its surface. The camp is empty now, the laughter long gone, but the memory remains a deck of American cards, once mocked, now eternal in the minds of those who played until dawn. History often remembers wars in numbers. 6 million tons of bombs dropped across Europe, 27,000 tanks built in Detroit, hundreds of thousands of prisoners shipped across the Atlantic. But behind those numbers are nights like these nights when men who were enemies sat down with nothing but a deck of cards and discovered, for a brief moment, what it meant to be simply human again. The American playing cards were not weapons, nor treaties, nor grand declarations. They were thin, fragile things, easy to bend or tear. And yet, they carried a strength that no uniform or order could provide the strength to restore laughter. In barracks that reeked of damp wool and fear, the shuffle of cards created a rhythm stronger than silence. In men who had once marched under banners of ideology, the turning of a hand revealed a gentleness they had forgotten. Years later, when the veterans returned to broken cities, they carried those cards as secret treasures. Some folded them into albums, some hid them in drawers, some placed them in the hands of grandchildren who could never fully grasp their weight. For the prisoners, those cards were not symbols of defeat or humiliation. They were proof that, even when history was at its darkest, a sliver of light could enter through the smallest of cracks. The war scarred landscapes and lives beyond repair, yet in memory, The cards remained untorn. They stood for the fragile but indestructible truth that play, laughter, and human connection can survive even behind barbed wire. Perhaps that is why, decades later, men who had seen empires collapse still dreamed of a night when they forgot the war, when they leaned over a table, when they played until dawn,